When Microsoft reached out and offered me a next generation Xbox, I jumped for the Series S. Why MVG, I hear you ask? Well, simply because the Series X has already had thousands of hours of analysis. We know what it can do and its power, but the Series S is still a big mystery. We've heard the reports that it's meant to be a next generation system, with 4 teraflops of compute, and it can even do ray tracing and 120Hz in games. All for $299. But is any of this really accurate, or is it just marketing gimmicks? What about the backward compatibility? Does it hold a candle to the very impressive showing that we've seen with the Xbox Series X already? And of course, how well does the power of the SSD translate to a system that has half the capacity and less memory? There's a lot to unpack here, so let's walk through the Series S in some detail. If you're like me and you've been a part of the Xbox ecosystem since the first day, you'll be in for a surprise here. Setting up a 360 or an Xbox One can take some time. Usually a software update is first, and then you have to log into your Xbox Live account. If you have two-factor authentication set up, you'll never remember your password just like me, and it can be a bit of a pain. But first-time setup on the Series S is much easier. You still get that firmware update, but you now have the option to set up your Xbox via the companion mobile app. I've used a previous version of the Xbox app on my phone before, but this one is actually quite useful. It's a very simple process to get set up. I also noticed that the download speeds over the network are a lot faster than the Xbox One. So all in all, this was a very simple process, and within a few minutes I was logged back into my account. And for the first time I experienced the new Xbox Series S dashboard. It's not a radical departure from the Xbox One X, but there are some neat touches. The snappiness is what I'm most interested in, and of course even on the Xbox Series S, it offers this up rather nicely. Because I've been an Xbox fan since the beginning, I've amassed quite the library of games, and if you have as well, then you're in for a real treat. This is one of the coolest features about the Xbox Series X, and that is, your games come with you. Not all of them of course, only a small number of OG Xbox and 300 or so Xbox 360 titles, but every Xbox One title is fully backward compatible with the Xbox Series X, and that even includes obscure games such as Crimson Dragon. Out of the box, this is pretty impressive, and I am expecting Microsoft to continue with their commitment to backward compatibility. And speaking of that, we are going to cover backward compatibility extensively in this episode. I do think it's one of the coolest features about the Xbox Series X. I've captured almost 1 terabyte of gameplay across 100 games, and there are some highlights and even some games in this list that even surprised me. But quick thoughts on Series S backward compatibility? It's excellent, and one that makes a $299 system quite compelling. But there are a few limitations to be aware of compared to the Xbox Series X that we will get into.
I see you have made it this far.
Onto the system menu, the display options offer up 720p, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K Ultra HD. Now you can also set 120Hz refresh rates, if your TV supports it of course. HDR and HDR10 are also supported. These are effectively the same options that you'll get with the Big Brother Xbox Series X. Does this mean that you can play Dirt 5 at 4K at 120Hz on the Series S? Well, no, but it's important to stress here that there is no limitation on 4K on the Series S, other than the developer. In fact, the Tourist runs at a native 4K on the Series S and smooth as butter at 60 frames per second. Of course, 4K games on the Series S will most likely be limited to a much smaller set of games, but it's nice to see Microsoft not wall off 4K for the system. But for the most part, when it comes to next generation gaming, unfortunately, it's difficult to assess the Series S and answer many of the concerns that developers have made due to its memory limitations. Cross-gen games means that optimized code for next gen may not be available in many instances. Watch Dogs Legion is a Series S enhanced game, but unfortunately, the patch will not be made available until the launch date of the Series S, which is November the 10th. Microsoft promises to have optimization patches available at launch for most games, but we'll need to wait to 2021 to really get a sense of how the Series S performs with the next generation games. But it's not a big mystery across the board. Even today, the Xbox Series S offers the same power of the internal SSD as the Xbox Series X, which is impressive. This is truly a feature that we've wanted for a while. You'll notice how fast the SSD performance is in everything you play. For example, loading a level in Sekiro on the Series S takes less than 10 seconds, and in another test, I compared a cold start of Ori and the Will of the Wisps between the Xbox One VCR and the Xbox Series S. To get to the main title screen took 30 seconds on the Xbox Series S, and on the Xbox One VCR takes over 1 minute and 18 seconds. And this of course does not take advantage of any next generation enhancements such as the velocity architecture. It's purely the combination of a fast CPU for decompression of assets along with fast SSD read speeds. Each game will take advantage of a loading speed boost, and in many cases it can be significant. One that stands out for me is Final Fantasy XV. Without any patches or optimizations at all, what we will see here is a startling comparison of the Xbox One VCR's loading performance against the next-gen PCIe SSD running on the Series S, with its blistering fast raw performance. The Series S loads the game in around 13 seconds. Over on the poor Xbox One VCR, it goes on and finally completing at 1 minute and 12 seconds. Once again, this is almost a minute faster. Once you get a taste of next gen, it's impossible to go back to anything before it. It's like going from a cable modem to fiber internet. Another is loading an Xbox original game via backward compatibility. The Xbox dashboard intro takes longer to load up than the game itself. It's simply that good. Fast SSD is a game changer, and I'm very glad to see that Microsoft didn't cut any corners on the performance of the drive itself. But unfortunately, the same cannot be said about the storage size. It's half the size of the Xbox Series X at 512GB, and only 360GB of that is usable. If you have a large library of games or a Game Pass subscription like me, you'll be filling up that SSD very quickly. I was able to max out the drive in the first few hours of using it. So you may want to consider an external SSD drive to offload anything not next gen to. Of course, you'll lose the speed. And for me, the 512GB internal drive is the biggest drawback of the hardware. You'll need to spend $219 for the 1TB SSD add-on module, but now that will put you in Xbox Series X territory, and this is where I struggle with a decision to reduce cost by reducing the size of the SSD, and hopefully with different third parties coming on board, we'll offer some cheap expansion drives on the market that will hopefully become more competitive. Still, I love the SSD in the Series S. It's truly a next-gen feature. Turning on an Xbox from a restart takes around 2 seconds. Quick Resume allows you to continue a game from a suspended state pretty much instantly. You can have up to 4 games that are suspended and Quick Resume into. I didn't think I'd be big on a feature like this, because generally speaking I tend to only play one game at a time. But as I was testing the Xbox Series S for this review, I noticed that I was using the Quick Resume feature quite regularly. For example, I can jump out of a game that I'm playing and load Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and as you can see, it jumps straight back into the game with only a few seconds delay. This feature is excellent and offers up to 4 Quick Resume slots. And if you're wondering why only 360GB is available from the max 512GB of storage, this is most likely the reason. Think of save states that are used in emulation. The idea and concept is exactly the same. And this does explain why you lose over 100GB of space to the operating system. Microsoft have also talked about Smart Delivery. This is simply a delivery system that allows you to play the best version of the game for the console that you own. On paper, I had questions about this. It kind of sounds like marketing fluff, but there are some interesting things to note. For example, when testing Forza Horizon 4 during the making of this review, the Xbox Series X version comes in at 81.9GB for the entire game. On the Xbox Series S, it's reduced to 71.4GB. This means that it's only pulling in assets for the game that it needs. Forza Horizon 4 is on the list of next-gen ready titles for the Series S, and during the making of this review I took a closer look at the performance. As you can see, it's smooth as butter, locked at 60 frames per second, running at either 1080p or 1440p. But is a 1080p 60 FPS title really considered next gen? Let's consider another example, Gears 5. This is another game that has a next gen update patch, and on the Xbox Series S, multiplayer supports 120 frames per second, and when tested, it works fine on a $299 system. It's quite astonishing to see this level of performance. In single player mode, it targets 1440p at 60 frames per second, and it reaches it too, thanks to the power of the Zen 2 architecture. But to be honest, we will need to wait for more next-gen patches to become available for third-party titles. But I think the general rule is, whatever the Series X does, the Series S can match it, albeit at a lower resolution. We can see some glimpses of brilliance and a promise of good things to come, but will that 8GB of RAM really be a factor? It's difficult to answer that right now. With next gen, we will undoubtedly see more resource-intensive games, and the floodgates will soon open. Whether the Series S can swim alongside the Series X or drown does remain to be seen. Yakuza Like a Dragon is a title that's received some attention recently. Performance mode runs the game at 60 frames per second, but to seal the deal, it must drop the resolution to 900p. The high-res mode drops the frame rate to 30 frames per second, but increases the resolution to 1440p, which does look quite crisp. There may be some concerns that the Series S doesn't have the power to run everything at 60 frames per second at 1080p, but this is really no fault of the hardware that's more than capable. Games still require their engines to be optimized and scalable, and the Dragon engine is an example of that. Unfortunately, at the time of making this review, we weren't able to test some additional next-gen titles, as patches had not yet appeared. So if you wanted more details into the next-gen performance of the Series S, I do recommend perhaps waiting and getting an idea of how these games will perform once these patches are made available. But let's talk about one of the best reasons to buy an Xbox Series S, and that is to bring your library of existing Xbox games with you via backward compatibility, and this will be a big focus for the next-gen Xbox. I've spent many hours testing backward compatible games from the earliest OG Xbox games to Xbox One enhanced titles, and there is a lot to cover here, both good and bad. So let's first look at the good. The Xbox Series S does indeed receive updates to backward compatibility, such as increased resolutions to 1080p. It also may increase frame rates, add auto HDR, and add general performance stability. Right off the bat, almost all sub 1080p Xbox One titles get a boost to 1080p, and frame rates are smoothened out. Take a look at Sunset Overdrive, for example, on the Xbox Series S, originally 900p on the Xbox One, with an adaptive frame rate that hovered between 20 to 30 frames per second. On the Xbox Series S, it's 1080p locked at 30, and that slight resolution and frame rate boost does make it a much more enjoyable experience. But let's raise the stakes. What about Hydro Thunder, an Xbox Live Arcade 360 game from Vector Unit and Sega? This was an arcade racer that ran at 30 frames per second on the 360. On the Series S, not only does it get a resolution update, it also gets its frame rate boosted from 30 to a smooth as butter 60 frames per second, and it's absolutely glorious. Take a look for yourself. What about over on the OG Xbox? The game Star Wars Republic Commando doesn't run well on backward compatibility on the Xbox One X. But on the Xbox Series S, at least 2 or so hours into the game I've played, it's upscaled to 1080p and doesn't seem to break a sweat running at 60 frames per second. And speaking of the original Xbox, how about Ninja Gaiden Black, boosted to 1080p 60 frames per second, and the game looks phenomenal on the Series S hardware. In general, each OG Xbox title I've tested is enhanced on the Xbox Series S in some way, with either the addition of auto HDR, increased resolution, or increased frame rates to make them pop in ways that you've never experienced before. Over on the Xbox Series X, backward compatibility of Grand Theft Auto 4 on the Xbox 360 was locked at 60 frames per second, and for the most part the Series S holds firm at 60, with only a very slight and occasional frame rate dip to 59 and 58. This is only limited to indoor scenes with lots of NPCs. Another Xbox 360 title that struggled to hold its frame rate is Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. With my 1 or so hours of playtime in the game, it runs smooth as butter at 60 frames per second at 1080p. Another 360 title that didn't come close to locking at 60 frames per second was Ninja Gaiden 2. On the 360, it was roughly around 45 frames per second. On the Xbox One VCR, it hovered between 50 to 60 FPS, but certainly not a lock. On the Xbox Series S, it's locked at 60, and no matter what I do, I cannot get that frame rate to drop. But what if you don't care about OG Xbox and 360 titles? Backward compatibility is still impressive. Before I show you these numbers, keep in mind, I haven't played all the way through these games, so I can't promise a locked experience, but the first hour or two of gameplay does show some impressive performance. Last generation Xbox One titles such as Ace Combat also take advantage of the Zen 2's processing and hits that magical 60 frames per second in many areas where it never even came close on the Xbox One. And with that, almost every Xbox One title that I tested on the Series S with an uncapped frame rate hit the 60 FPS mark. But there are a few downsides to the Series S backward compatibility, because the system is considering the Xbox One S as its predecessor. Some games such as Final Fantasy XV, Rise of the Tomb Raider and Sekiro do not include the performance mode options. Therefore, all three of these games will max out at 30 frames per second. This is a little disappointing, and I would like to see Microsoft patch these titles to incorporate performance mode options as the Series S should, because it's more than capable of handling them. Still, if you're coming from the Xbox One S or the VCR, the Series S will not disappoint you. So yeah, the takeaway for backward compatibility is, you won't get 4K, and in some cases you will miss out on performance mode options, but what you get here is nothing short of incredible on a $299 machine. One feature that I tested that worked really well was the remote play. You can pair up your Xbox Series S to your phone via the Companion mobile app, and then simply connect up a Bluetooth controller to play the games on your mobile device. The delay is definitely there, but it's minimal, I guess, and this is the same technology that powers Project xCloud, Microsoft's streaming service that's still in beta. Remote play isn't anything new, of course. The PlayStation has been doing this for years, but I do appreciate the ease of setup and user experience. One last thing is heat and noise. So many news outlets reporting claims that the Xbox Series S overheated, ran hot, could heat up your apartment and other such nonsense. What about the Xbox Series S? Well, I picked up a thermal camera, and after 2 hours of playing Watch Dogs Legion, I can report that heat and thermals is well within an acceptable range. The temperature at the fan reaches 121 degrees Fahrenheit or roughly 50 degrees Celsius. Definitely no throttling going on, and the best news is the system is super quiet. I literally cannot hear it above the ambient noise in my office here. Super quiet and cool, just the way I like a game console. Microsoft wins points here for some good engineering. And now that the embargo has lifted, we'll be opening the system up in a future episode, so stay tuned for that. So in conclusion, the Xbox Series S is a little machine that packs a ton of power. With backward compatibility and a Game Pass subscription, it's unparalleled in terms of value for money. If you've pre-ordered one, you can rest easy that you'll be happy with the hardware. A fast SSD, smart delivery, velocity architecture, quick resume, backward compatibility, these aren't buzzwords. These are real features that Microsoft have delivered on. The only real drawbacks for me are the 360 gigabytes of storage you'll get and a lack of performance mode options in some games. I wanted to review the Xbox Series S because I think it was the more interesting system of the two, and I can absolutely recommend it to anyone who wants to jump into next gen but doesn't want to spend $499 in doing so. Now, unfortunately, I was not able to test some next gen games that were provided to me by Microsoft because we are still waiting for next-gen patches to appear. For example, Watch Dogs Legion as well as Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Those patches will appear at a later date. And if there's something interesting to share with you guys on those, I'll definitely do that in a up-and-coming episode. But for me, I'm very impressed with the hardware. I love the small form factor. I love the velocity architecture, the fast SSD, the quick resume. All that works as advertised, and quite honestly, it's an absolute game changer. And coupled with backward compatibility, which was something I spent many hours testing personally because I'm a big fan of, as you guys know, backward compatibility, I thought the experience was excellent. And I think the biggest takeaway about the Xbox Series S, if I was to sum it up in a few words, it's the exact same experience that you'll get on the Series X, albeit at a lower resolution. And if you think of it that way, then you know what to expect. So I'm very impressed with the hardware. I do applaud Microsoft for coming out with the Series S. It was a gamble for them, no question about it, but I think it will pay off for them in the long run. Well guys, we are going to leave it here for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this episode, leave me a thumbs up and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.